First of all, it's lovely to see you all here, and it's great to know that you're interested in changing laws and towards animals in our societies. And of course, my job is nothing to do with the legal side of it. My job is changing attitudes towards animals. But the two of these efforts meet. I really wish that we could have had a dog in here. It would have made a lot of difference. I think that when we have a dog in a room, it just, everybody's heart opens and people are more able to listen freely. But since we don't have a dog, I at least will bring the voice of an animal into this space. And I suspect you can all guess the voice I'm going to bring into this space. And that just means I'm me, I'm Jane. Chimpanzees all have a different call, and we know when we hear that call exactly who is calling, which is very helpful to individuals living in a scattered community. They don't travel around as a troop or group, but in small groups. Well, I'm not here to talk about chimpanzees. In fact, you're probably interested in what I'm going to say, and let me share with you the fact I'm interested too, because I've never given a talk like this before, and what I have in my mind is so many, many thoughts. I can't possibly condense them into this small space, because this is such an interesting subject. I'm 83 years old, so I've been on this planet longer than most of you in this room. And during that time, I have seen so much change in our attitude towards animals. I grew up with Dr. Dolittle and Tarzan and loving animals and spending hours outside and learning about them, so that right from the beginning, I had this affinity with animals. Some young people can't have that opportunity because they're living in an inner city with few animals. But I think it's really important for young people to be able to spend time with animals. And if you can't hear me, please wave, because it doesn't sound very loud to me, but I'm going to hope that you can. So, as you all know, I went and studied our closest living relatives, our genetically closest living relatives, the chimpanzees. Equally close genetically is one of the lesser known great apes, the bonobo. We're genetically equidistant from each other. And when I went there at the behest of Dr. Louis Leakey in 1960, to try and learn about chimpanzees, I was so fortunate. Nobody had been out in the field before. Everything I saw was new. And it became very obvious as soon as the chimps lost their fear of me. And at first, they'd never seen a white ape before, which is basically what we are, and they would run away. But eventually, I got the confidence of each member of the community. I came to know them as individuals. I named them. I began to learn about their different personalities. And then came the magic breakthrough day, for science anyway, when I saw a chimpanzee reach out, break off a grass stem, use it as a tool to fish for termites, and then break off a leafy twig and strip off the leaves and use that as a tool to fish for termites. So if you saw that today, it wouldn't be exciting. Back then, it was. Why? Because it was thought that humans and only humans used and made tools. We were defined then as man, the toolmaker. So that when my mentor, Louis Leakey, got a telegram telling him what I'd seen, he said, well, we shall have to redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans. So this is the change I want to talk about. After I'd been in the field 2 years, after I got to know so much, nothing like what we know now, but still a great deal about chimpanzee behavior, Louis Leakey told me that I had to go to Cambridge to get a degree. I hadn't been to college. Nevertheless, he said, Jane, we don't have time for you to mess about with a BA. I've got you a place in Cambridge University to do a PhD in ethology. And I didn't even know what ethology meant. And I was very nervous when I got to Cambridge. So can you imagine how I felt when many of the professors told me scathingly that I'd conducted my study all wrong? First of all, I shouldn't have named the chimpanzees. They should have had numbers. That was scientific. Secondly, I couldn't talk about them having personalities. Only human beings had personalities, I was told. I couldn't talk about them having minds capable of something like thinking. That, too, was unique to us. And as for talking about their emotions, happiness, sadness, fear, despair, grief, and so on, that was the height of anthropomorphism, giving non-human animals human characteristics. Well, even though I was nervous, even though I hadn't been to college before, I had learned from my teacher when I was a child that in this respect anyway, these erudite professors were completely wrong. And the teacher who taught me this was my dog, Rusty. You cannot share your life in a meaningful way with a dog or a cat, a rabbit, a horse, a goat, a parrot, whatever, and not know that the professors are wrong. We know that animals have personalities, minds and feelings. And fortunately, because the chimps are so like us genetically, so that we differ from them in the composition of the DNA by only just over 1%. And there are these striking similarities in the immune system and the composition of the blood and the anatomy of the brain. Because of this biological similarity, and because of the facts that were coming to light, not only from my studies at Gombe, but other studies that began after World War II, so that people came back with stories about elephants, about lions, about whales and dolphins. And so gradually, the scientific mind was beginning to come out of its box and agree that we were not, after all, the only beings on this planet with personality, mind, and emotion. So how did this all start? Because if we talk to the indigenous people anywhere around the world, whether it's your Maori or whether it's the Australian Aboriginals or the Native Americans or the First Nation people or the Pygmy tribes that I've had time with in Africa, or the indigenous people in Taiwan or China, all of them believe that we are one with the animals, part of this same amazing and wonderful animal kingdom. I think one of the reasons that we, from the Western world, have got so bogged down with this imaginary wall dividing us quite separately from the rest of the animals. I mean, when I got to Cambridge, it was truly believed by the scientists that there was a difference of kind between us and the other animals, not a difference of degree. And I think a lot of blame can be attributed to a wrong translation in the book of Genesis, where it says man was given dominion over the animals, birds, fishes, and so forth. And that word dominion is a wrong translation. I don't remember the exact Hebrew word. You can look it up. The correct translation is something between a good steward and a wise king. And if we think of the difference between dominion over and good stewardship and a wise king, there's a world of difference. So that religious attitudes were, I think, responsible for informing science. I don't really know if that's true, but I certainly think that this mistranslation of that Hebrew word has had an awful lot to do with shaping Western attitudes towards animals. So how fascinating it was that as science began to look outside this box it had hemmed itself in with, one by one, there were criteria set up. Well, at least we're the only beings who do this. At least we're the only beings who do that. One of them was, an early one, was self-recognition. Well, the chimps blew that pretty smart, put a chimp in front of a mirror, and they can, the first experiment was putting blobs of paint on a chimp's face when the chimp was anesthetized, and the chimp would look in the mirror and immediately touch the different blobs to see what they were. So that was blown. And one by one, all the things dividing us from the other animals were broken down by chimps or some other creature. And so now today, we realize, indeed, we are part of this kingdom. But we've got a long way to go, haven't we, in how we see our relationship with animals in different parts of the world. Animals are typically thought of as things. And this has been a legal battle going on for many years now to have chimpanzees and other apes accepted as persons. It takes a long time. I'm sure all of you, anything to do with the legal world of animal rights, has heard about Stephen Wise. He began about almost 30 years ago fighting for the recognition of chimps as persons. And he hasn't given up, and cases have actually come to trial, and so far he's lost, but he still hasn't given up. And I was reading the other day about the fact that here in New Zealand, after a 140-year struggle, finally a river has been acknowledged to, what was it, have, well, whatever it is, legal rights of a person. And that was a major breakthrough. And that's the sort of thing that should give courage to any of you who go on to fight for the recognition of human rights for chimpanzees. But as I said, I have not ever become involved in legal issues because too often we hear about the abuse of human rights. And if we're still abusing human rights, knowing that we're all part of one family, our DNA is the same, then quite clearly there's going to be abuse of animals. And it turns out that the two can be linked, so that we find with many of the mass murderers that there is a history in their childhood of cruelty to animals. So fighting for animal rights is an important thing to do, because it's one thing we can hold up and say, this is wrong, this person mustn't be allowed to do that, and there will be laws to uphold that. But my job has been fighting for human responsibility. And we can have as many laws as we like, and while there is greed and corruption and hatred and religious intolerance, we will find ways to get around those laws. And that indeed is what is happening. I know most about this in relation to the chimpanzees. And in Africa, in the different range states, there are the killing, the hunting, the selling of chimpanzees is against the law because they are an endangered species. But does that stop the illegal bushmeat trade? No, it doesn't. Does it stop the selling of infant chimps in markets? No, it doesn't. If we call in the authorities because of the law, then it's possible to confiscate those chimpanzees. And that indeed is what the Jane Goodall Institute does, and we have them living in sanctuaries. But we still have this terrible poaching crisis. We become involved in that simply because the Jane Goodall Institute, although its primary focus is on the great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, nevertheless, through our youth program, we actually are concerned about animals of all kinds and their abuse. Poaching of elephants, poaching of rhinos, poaching of tigers, it's all against the law. And yet, think what's happening because of greed and corruption. But there's always signs of hope. And one of the countries I turn to as a sign of hope, believe it or not, is China. Over the years that I've been working in China, it's about 20 years now, since I introduced our youth program and the Jane Goodall Institute in Shanghai, Beijing, and Chengdu, I've seen an amazing difference in attitude towards animals and in attitude towards the environment. When I first went to China, one didn't dare speak about the environment because it was such a strong communist regime which didn't allow any kind of freedom of speech at all. And then came the great floods because of the deforestation on the steep slopes. And that was the first time when ordinary people began to dare to speak about the destruction of the environment. And that was the time when I arrived in China almost as though it was meant, and introduced our youth program, Roots and Shoots, into Chinese schools. So that today people say to me, well, of course I care about animals. I was in your Roots and Shoots program when I was in primary school. I watched your National Geographic documentaries when I was in primary school. So the point that I'm making here is it's when we understand about things that we care about them and want to help. And today, through our Roots and Shoots program, which is now in 99 countries, more and more young people are beginning to understand about animals. To get a change of attitude, it often doesn't work to argue. And I know the legal profession is all about careful arguments, which are important, of course they are. But if you really want to get a change of attitude, you need to have the heart involved as well as the mind. And I truly believe that we can only achieve our true human potential when heart and mind work in harmony. The one thing that makes us most different from all the other animals, chimpanzees included, is the fact that we have developed this extraordinary intellect. And yes, chimpanzees can be taught 400 or so of the signs of the American Sign Language, ASL. I think Coco the gorilla, the famous gorilla, she learned about 700 different signs. And so, actually I should back off there. And I should say that parrots too, I know a parrot who has just said his 1,700th word. And a word is only counted as part of his vocabulary when he said it 3 times in the right context, unprompted. That's a bird. And so when we come to the primates who are genetically so like us, it shouldn't really surprise us that they're capable of these intelligent acts. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment because it's fascinating. But here we are, chimpanzees learning sign language. A chimpanzee in Japan, a young Ayumu, whose mother Ai, some of you may have heard of, Ai was taught to work on a computer. And I won't go into everything that I learned on a computer. What I want to say is that her son Ayumu was never taught by a human, but just watched his mother, and he can do things on a computer, noting the position of randomly numbers 0 to 9, spaced randomly each time he turns the machine on. And he has to remember from 0 to 9 where they are on this computer screen. And the moment he presses the 0, then the screen goes blank. And by the time I've found 0, 1, and 2 in their random places, he's already going through the whole lot. It's extraordinary. People have gone from all over the world to see. He's like an enfant savant. So there he is. There are the chimps. Very amazing. Amazing intelligence in other animals too. But we've designed a rocket that went up to Mars, from which crept a little robot. And it's crawling around on the surface of Mars and taking photographs. So don't you find it strange, with your legal minds, that the most intellectual creature to ever walk planet Earth is destroying its only home? And you all know what we're doing. I'm not going to go through the list of pollution and deforestation and shrinking freshwater supplies and sprinkling poisons, chemical poisons on the land in order to grow food to feed ourselves. I won't go into all that. Climate change is with us. But we've only got one home. Those photographs from Mars make it pretty clear, to me anyway, I don't want to go and live on Mars. I doubt if any of you do. We've just got planet Earth. So do you think that the reason that we are destroying planet Earth is because of this disconnect between the clever brain and the human heart? Is it because we're making decisions based on how will this benefit me now? How will this benefit the next shareholders meeting? How will this benefit my next political campaign? Rather than, as the indigenous people, how will this decision benefit our generations in the future? That's what's gone. And that's why, as I was traveling around the world, trying to raise money for our programs in Africa for chimpanzee conservation and the alleviation of poverty, I was meeting so many young people who had lost hope and who were either depressed or angry or apathetic, mostly apathetic. And when I asked them why this was so, they said, well, we feel like this because you've compromised our future and there's nothing we can do about it. They're right. If you hear the saying, we haven't inherited this planet from our parents, we've borrowed it from our children. We haven't borrowed the future of our children. We've stolen it. We've been stealing it for years. We're still stealing it today. So this doesn't really relate to the subject of animals in law, but somehow it's all part of reaching into the human heart so that we understand. We need to understand something about what is it like to be an animal, what is it like to be an indigenous person living in the heart of the African forest, so that we can sympathize with them, we can empathize with them. And I was told when I was at Cambridge that I mustn't have any empathy for my animal subjects because that was not scientific. And so the feeling was, to be a good scientist, you've got to be very cold and very objective. And if you have empathy with your animal subject, you can't be objective. And that's absolute rubbish. I've proven it. It's true. You can be totally upset at what you're watching, and you can make absolutely accurate recordings. And I know that's true because I've done it. So I wanted just to spend a couple of moments on animal intellect, because I think this is really important when it comes to our relationship with animals. So I've talked about the chimpanzee and the gorilla. And one thing that I'm often asked, when we're looking at, well, surely we're different because of this, we're different because of that, we're different because we're sentient. Well, there's a lot of study of animal sentience today. And you can get a PhD in animal personality and animal emotions. I couldn't have because they didn't exist when I went to Cambridge. But what about a sense of humor? Can animals possibly have a sense of humor? Well, I'm going to tell you one story about that gorilla I mentioned earlier, Coco. Coco had just learned, she was about 10 years old at the time, she'd just learned all the different signs for the different colors. And this young woman was told, entertain Coco while we prepare her supper. So this young woman was new to the lab, and she's signing back and forth to Coco, and she thinks, well, I'll test her on her colors. So she picked up different objects. Yes, this is blue. Yes, this is green. Coco makes the right sign. This is black. This is gray. This is gold. And then she picks up a piece of white cloth. What color is it, Coco? Coco signs, which is red. Coco, you know better than that. What color is this? Red. And in the end, the young woman gets cross because she knows Coco knows. So she says, Coco, if you don't tell me the right answer, you won't get apple juice for your supper. Coco reaches out, takes a piece of white cloth, removes a minute piece of red fluff and goes, red, red, red. So, yes, I've seen examples of chimp sense of humor, but that one is so obvious and so real. See? Okay, one more thing. In 1986, I left Gombe, although we still have a research station there, because at a big conference in America, we brought together for the first time the people studying chimpanzees in different parts of Africa. And although we put the conference together in order to find out differences in cultural behavior, And some of you are thinking, chimpanzees with culture? Well, we talk about whales having cultures and birdsong being cultural. There's a definition of human culture that is behavior passed from one generation to the next through observational learning. And because of this definition, we can talk about culture in many different animal species. So at that conference, we also had a session on conservation. And it was absolutely shocking to me to see that right across Africa, chimpanzee numbers were dropping, forests were being cut down, the beginning of the bushmeat trade, and the shooting of mothers to sell babies for entertainment, and in those days, medical research. We had a session on conditions in some captive situations, and that included secretly filmed footage of chimpanzees, our closest relatives, these intensely social beings in medical research laboratories. And I couldn't sleep after that. 5 foot by 5 foot cages, imprisoned for 20, 30 years. The only contact with people they had was when somebody in a white coat came to take blood. They couldn't escape. I've seen the terror on the faces of chimpanzees when somebody is approaching with a needle. And you imagine being in a 5 foot by 5 foot cage, the sort of things that the Nazis did to the Jews that are still going on in many prisons around the world today. This is where animal rights and human rights, it's blurred. We're still doing these unspeakable things to humans. But at any rate, this was what I saw about chimpanzees. So on the one hand, I went to Africa to learn more about the plight of the chimps. And as I was doing that, I was learning more about the plight of so many of the people living in abject poverty around chimpanzee habitat, and realized that in order to protect the chimpanzees, it was really important to try and alleviate this poverty, to improve the lives of the people, to make them into our partners in conservation. And that's what we've managed to do. We're now Jane Goodall Institute, operating in 7 different African countries, improving the lives of the people, which in turn is improving the environment. Because when you're really poor, you cut down the last tree in your desperate effort to grow food or to sell it as charcoal to make some money. And if you're in an urban area and you're desperately poor, you buy the cheapest food. You can't afford to ask, where did this come from? Did it harm the environment? Did it involve cruelty towards animals or child slave labor? You have to buy the cheapest. So alleviating poverty is tremendously important. And on the other side of it, there's the unsustainable lifestyle of most of the rest of us. Don't all of us have more than we need? I think we do. And something I really want to sit down with some top economists, top economist minds, and talk about this conundrum of how do we have unlimited economic growth on a planet with finite natural resources. It's a huge problem. And all of us who are concerned with conservation come up again and again that when big business comes in, usually big business wins. And on top of that, we have corruption. We have governments who are basically in the pockets of some of the big businesses because of the corruption. And I don't even need to tell you which countries are some of the worst. So we have all these terrible problems to try and overcome. But to go back to that conference in 1986 and this secretly filmed footage that I saw, I knew I had to try and do something for the chimps. And that meant going into the labs and seeing with my own eyes what was going on. It's the worst time of my life, I think. Sat down with National Institute of Health to see if we could do something about it. And it's been a very long fight. It's been about 30 years. Nothing happens quickly. Remember I said the river was given the legal rights of a person after 140 years. This has taken 30. But 2 years ago, the National Institute of Health released all of the chimpanzees from about 140 of them from, what did I say, 140? Yes. From its various labs. Why did they release them? And this is really interesting. It wasn't on animal welfare grounds, not at all, although they might have. It was because the new director of NIH, the one who unraveled the human genome, sent a group of scientists, his scientists, around to investigate every single protocol done on these chimpanzees. Now, it wasn't 140, it was about 400. I knew it was more. So about 400 chimpanzees in the different labs around America. And they were asked to answer two questions. Did this protocol benefit human health? Did this protocol potentially benefit human health? The answer? Not one. Those chimpanzees were released from their bondage because science showed that they were not being used in an appropriate way, certainly, but that the research was useless. I could talk quite a lot about that because I learned about it. But it took a long time to get the chimpanzees out of these cages. And I think that's what we face when we seek either to change attitudes or to change legal systems, which is what you're interested in. And Stephen Wise, fighting for the personhood of chimpanzees, he's not giving up. Twice now, I think it's twice, you can probably correct me, but at least twice, he's brought cases to the court to claim legal personhood for particular chimpanzees. And he's almost won, but he lost, but he hasn't given up. So it's going to take time. And I think those were the main points that I wanted to get across. And because we've got about 5 minutes, something like that. 5? Well, you come and decide. 10 minutes. Will you come up here and pick the questions, please? I don't want to be the one. So maybe nobody has. Well, I'm telling you, if you were 8 or 10 years old, you would all have your hands up, but adults don't.
Questions.
So are there any questions? Because I really wanted to, a brave person.
Dr. Goodall, I was interested in what you said about the Roots and Shoots program, especially in China. Just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about.
She's interested in the Roots and Shoots program in China. Well, we started it. Roots and Shoots is basically its main message. Every single individual matters and has a role to play. And because I've learned about the interconnectedness of life forms, so if you're in a rainforest, one little species disappears, and that can influence the entire ecosystem because another species depends on it for food and so on. And so because of that, we decided from the beginning with 12 high school students in Tanzania 25 years ago, we decided each group of Roots and Shoots, one, they themselves would choose what projects they wanted to do because we all have different interests. Some of us are passionate about animals, some of us are passionate about human problems, some of us are passionate about the environment. So each group between them would tackle these 3 areas. And today we are, as I said, in 99 countries, shortly to be 100, and we have about 150,000 active groups. We have members from kindergarten through university, very strong in university, and we're growing all the time. And we have all the alumni. These are the people in China who came up to me and said we were in Roots and Shoots in primary school. And so this Roots and Shoots program is something I would love to see it introduced into law schools because I think it's really important that we find ways to link up our intellectual brains and our human hearts. It's the same in science. We need compassion. We need to be compassionate people. And the lack of compassion has led to many problems in China and elsewhere. But China, for example, and I truly believe Roots and Shoots has had something to do with this. Our young people have had permission to do demonstrations, which is not easy to get in China, but we are a legally accepted NGO, and they've demonstrated against shark fin soup and against the ivory trade. Shark's fin soup has now been banned from all government state formal dinners. And the president of China has announced that at the end of this year, all ivory trade will be banned, all ivory trade, internal and external. And already more than 1/3 of the ivory carving workshops have been closed down.
What do you think about the hunters in Africa that travel from America? They pay good money to go out game hunting and claim that this is helpful
I think we need to.
Sorry, dear.
What do you think about the big game hunters that pay big money to the African countries, and they claim that that supports conservation?
I simply cannot understand I cannot understand people who think that it's sport to go and kill the most beautiful animals. I think it's actually affecting the gene pool of the species, because your hunter wants to get the lion with the biggest mane, the elephant with the biggest tusks, the rhino with the longest horn, and he wants to stick it on his wall. And this is affecting the gene pool, because those are the animals who've been bred that way to be, the prime. That's the way the species has grown, and it does need to have some law, I think.
Jane, you've spoken so much about some of the characteristics that we used to think that human beings were different from animals, things like the so-called human-only ability to have a language, culture, theory of mind, and we've spoken about how we now know these things are not true anymore. I wonder, though, if there's one way in which perhaps humans are different. Humans seem to have a particular propensity to destroy other living species and the environment when we don't need to for our own survival. I wonder if you could comment on whether you think that this is a difference of degree or a difference of kind, comparing humans to other animals, and then also perhaps say something about our ability to exercise compassion and care for other species. Would that be some way in which we're different also? Thank you.
About the destruction for our own use, I can certainly say that chimpanzees wouldn't have any inhibition about destroying an area if they wanted to destroy it to get food or something like that. It was a big shock to me to find that chimpanzees have a dark, brutal, aggressive side. They're capable of a kind of primitive war and murder, killing. And they do this mostly because they have marked territories, and if they spy, and it's usually a group of 3 or more males, they patrol, and if they spy an individual from a neighboring community, they give chase, and if they catch that unfortunate victim, male or female, they will subject him or her to a brutal attack. The only individuals who are immune from this sort of behavior are the adolescent females who haven't yet given birth, and they are actively recruited to increase it acts to increase the gene pool. The males do it for another reason, I'm sure. But at the same time, probably a bit like, shall I mention a president who might enjoy that sort of thing? I won't say the name. But at the same time, they also show love, compassion, and true altruism, defining true altruism as helping an individual who is not related to you, so that it doesn't increase your genetic inheritance, your genetic, what you leave behind you. And we have great examples of individuals adopting orphans, of individuals who aren't related to them, of individuals running in to rescue an infant when they're not related at all. And when we come to captivity, we have examples. I mean, maybe I should give this one example because it's sort of rather pertinent. It's a chimpanzee who was in medical research. His mother was shot in the wild, and he was used in medical research. He was lucky. He was sent away at 15. They didn't want him anymore. And he went to live on an island with 3 females who'd also been in medical research. And the young man told to look after them. It was in a zoo. He was told, don't go anywhere near them. They hate people. They'll try to kill you. And of course, they're 8-10 times stronger than we are. So at first, he just took food and threw it from his little paddle boat. But he began to watch them, and he saw how they were so excited when the food appeared that they would embrace each other and kiss before they even took a bite. And an infant was born, and this male, known as Old Man, he absolutely loved this infant. He would carry the infant around as soon as the mother allowed him to, and rescue him from anything that looked like danger. And so Mark, the young man, he felt, I must have some sort of relationship with these amazing beings. And he began going a little closer and closer. And one day, he held out a banana, and Old Man took it from his hand. He said, Jane, I know just how you felt when David Greybeard took a banana from your hand. And one day he dared step onto the island. Nothing happened. One day he approached Old Man, who was sitting, and groomed him. One day, Old Man turned and groomed him back. And one day, he dared to tickle Old Man in his ticklish neck, and Old Man laughed. So basically, they became friends, and the females kept away, but they didn't do anything until one day, this Mark slipped, fell flat on his face. Unfortunately, the infant was nearby, got frightened and screamed. So the infant's mother, as mothers will, rushed to defend her child and bit deep into his thigh as he lay flat on the ground. And the other two females rushed over to help their friend, and one bit into his neck and one bit his wrist. And he thought, well, how am I going to get away from these three females? And he looked up. Now here comes Old Man, thundering across the island, his hair bristling, his lips bunched in a furious scowl. And he thinks, he's coming to rescue his precious child, and he prepared to die. But what did Old Man do? Old Man pulled each of those three females away and kept them away while Mark dragged himself to his little paddle boat and safety. And I saw Mark when he came out of hospital sometime later. He said, Jane, there's no question. Old Man saved my life. And to me, this is very symbolic, because if a chimpanzee who's been abused by people can help a human friend in time of need, then surely we, with our greater capacity for understanding and compassion, can do the same for the animals in their time of need. And that's why I'm so happy to have been asked to come and speak to this group, because you're just those people who can reach out to the animals in their time of need, in all the ways that I've mentioned and all the ways that we abuse animals that I haven't mentioned, like the animals in medical research. And a point worth mentioning here, and I know this is the end, we run out of time, but a point worth mentioning is to remember that chimps were taken out of medical research because it was shown that what was being done to them wasn't actually beneficial to humans. And that's an argument for anybody here interested in getting other animals out of research labs and out of the torment that they endure, should remember. And does the abuse of animals in intensive factory farms, I'm sure there's somebody here who's horrified by that. There's a very difficult moral situation you have here in New Zealand, where your amazing endemic species are being wiped out by invasive species. And so is there a need to remove the invasive species? Probably the answer is yes. I believe the answer is yes. But it's not right to talk about these invasive species as vermin, as pests. They didn't put themselves here. We put them there. So yes, they must probably be removed, but let's try and do it humanely. Don't let's have another situation that I read about and was so shocked about, where a school set a task for the children to kill as many possums as they could and to dress them up in clothes. It's not the possum's fault. We don't want children thinking about any animal as pests. And I didn't get a chance to tell you about the amazing intellectual behavior of birds, the incredible intellectual behavior of the octopus. And if you don't know about the octopus, please Google octopus and clamshell. Look it up. And you may see several, but check through until you'll know the one I mean. Because what the octopus will do, they have soft bodies, and they need rocks to hide in, to keep them safe. And for some reason, octopus sometimes want to go to areas where there aren't any rocks. And then you'll see pictures of octopus taking an empty clamshell or a coconut shell with 2 tentacles on one side and the other half of the shell on this side, and then using the other 4 to go across the ocean floor. And when they get to where they want to go, one half of the shell is put down, and then they wriggle their soft bodies that can go very tiny into the shell, and then with the other tentacles, they reach out and put the other half on top. They make houses. And what about a bumblebee being taught to roll a little ball, and if it drops into a hole, he gets a reward of nectar? That's amazing, but even more amazing is the fact that another bumblebee who hasn't been taught can learn that simply by watching the trained bumblebee. So I leave you with that. These animals are continually opening our minds, and it's about time that a generation of young people grows up not saying, "Isn't it amazing I've learned that," but taking it for granted that animals indeed are sibling species on this planet.